Keanu stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupting into applause. But there was a sharp, almost palpable tension in the air. The talk show host, sitting smugly at the desk, flashed a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something in his smile, something cutting, like he was eager for a fight, and Keanu knew it. He had been on this stage countless times, but today, this host felt different. The host, a seasoned television personality known for his biting wit and relentless sarcasm, leaned forward, microphone in hand, eyeing Keanu like a hawk. "Keanu Reeves," he began, his voice dripping with irony. "The man who somehow made being quiet an art form. I've never quite understood the appeal. You'd think a guy who spent so many years in the public I don't know, have something interesting to say." The words were like a challenge, meant to provoke, meant to throw Keanu off balance. But Keanu remained calm. His face was the epitome of serenity, stoic, composed, as if he were unaffected. But underneath, his heart beat a little faster, and his mind flashed to the countless times people had underestimated him, mistook his quiet demeanor for weakness. And now, this man was pushing him into a corner. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, Keanu allowed the silence to stretch for a moment, letting the weight of the host's words settle into the space between them. The audience waited in anticipation, sensing the impending clash. The host smirked, clearly enjoying his power. "Keanu, you've built a career out of playing the same role. This stoic, mysterious guy who doesn't talk much, who just shows up and gets the job done. But here's the thing. In real life, that kind of attitude only works for so long. People want to hear what you think. What's the point of being famous if you can't speak your mind? Or is it that you just don't have anything to say?" Keanu's eyes met his, a flicker of something deeper in them. Not anger, not frustration, but a quiet understanding and knowing. The host's voice was rising now, relishing the tension, pushing harder. The crowd waited for Keanu to react. He leaned forward slowly, meeting the host's gaze. "You're right," Keanu said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something intense. "People want to hear what I think. But sometimes people talk without thinking, without understanding the weight of their words." The host faltered for a second. The crowd hushed, sensing the shift in energy. The host recovered quickly, though, his smirk widening. "Oh, come on? You're telling me you're above all this? That you don't care about fame, money, recognition?" He laughed, an exaggerated chuckle that filled the space. "Please, don't act like you're too good for this game." Keanu's gaze never wavered, but the air around them thickened. The audience could feel it now, the subtle change in the dynamic. Keanu wasn't just sitting there anymore, taking the insults. He was standing his ground, not with anger, but with something deeper, something they hadn't expected. "I never asked for fame," Keanu said softly. "I never asked for any of it. But I did ask for respect." His words were measured, but they hit like a hammer. You see, when you live in a world where people are constantly throwing their judgments at you, the easiest thing to do is to let those judgments define you. But I've learned not to let anyone do that. Not you, not anyone. The host, momentarily taken aback, quickly recovered. "Well, isn't that nice? The humble Keanu Reeves, who lives above the rest of us, out of reach, above all the mess." He leaned back in his chair, feigning a yawn. "I guess you think your silence is some kind of virtue, right? That the less you say, the more profound you are?" Keanu didn't flinch. He looked at the host, but his words weren't just for him. "No," he said, his voice still calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "I think sometimes the less we say, the more we understand. The more we listen, the more we learn. And there's wisdom in that silence, a depth that you can't see if you're always talking over it." The host's smile faltered, and the crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the host's, and for a moment, it felt like time slowed. The host looked uneasy, almost as if the words had struck too close to something personal. But Keanu didn't stop there. "You talk about fame like it's the end-all be-all," he continued, his tone soft but firm. "Like it's the measure of a person's worth. But fame doesn't teach you anything about who you really are. It doesn't show you the pain or the struggles. It doesn't show you the loneliness that often comes with it." The host opened his mouth to retort, but something in Keanu's words seemed to stop him. The audience, too, felt the shift, a moment of quiet reflection in the middle of the confrontation. Keanu's eyes softened, just slightly, as if he were speaking from a place of experience. I've seen the world from different angles. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I've also learned something that's not easy to teach. That kindness, humility, respect, they go farther than all the noise in the world. And no matter how loud the world gets, it's the quiet ones who listen, who truly understand. The host blinked, suddenly unsure of himself. His usual bravado seemed to falter, the weight of Keanu's words pressing down on him. The crowd was still watching, waiting. Keanu stood slowly, his posture as calm as ever. So, I'll leave you with this. Silence doesn't mean weakness. It means strength. Strength that you don't have to prove to anyone. He turned, walking toward the exit, leaving the host speechless in his seat. The audience sat in stunned silence, processing the weight of what had just unfolded. There was no grand speech, no dramatic exit, just the quiet power of truth that had cut through the noise. As Keanu left the stage, the host sat back, his expression unreadable. The silence in the room was deafening, the truth of Keanu's words echoing in every corner. The show had taken a turn no one had expected, and as the camera zoomed in on the host's lost, confused face, the audience was left with one question. Could a man truly find peace in silence? Or was it just another form of escapism? The truth, it seemed, was far more complicated than anyone had realized. The moments after Keanu's departure were filled with a strange kind of tension that the show's host couldn't shake off. The crowd's applause had quickly faded into a hollow silence, and the energy in the studio seemed to drain away. The host, once so full of bravado and confidence, was left staring at the empty seat across from him. The absence of Keanu's quiet presence hung heavily in the air. The producer's voice in his earpiece tried to bring him back to the moment. Cut to commercial now. Just cut to commercial. But the host didn't move, his eyes still locked on the space where Keanu had been sitting just moments before. The words Keanu had spoken to him, so soft but so powerful, echoed in his mind. Silence doesn't mean weakness. It means strength. For the first time in his career, he felt exposed. His usual sharp wit and sarcastic remarks felt trivial, unimportant in comparison to what had just unfolded. This was not the show he was used to running. This was something entirely different. He glanced at the cameras, still rolling, capturing every second of his disoriented, silent state. Cut to commercial. The producer's voice was more urgent now. And finally, the host snapped out of his daze. His movements were mechanical as he gestured toward the crew, and the live broadcast cut to an advertisement. But the damage had already been done. The audience had seen it, and they would never forget the way Keanu had left him speechless. Backstage, Keanu had already made his way out, walking briskly through the corridors with his usual quiet grace. There was no rush in his steps, no need for him to explain himself to anyone. He had done what he came to do, and the rest didn't matter. The encounter with the host, the tension in the studio, it was nothing compared to the deeper questions he'd been grappling with for years. Keanu was used to being misunderstood. The world saw him as a quiet, enigmatic figure, someone who existed in the background of the flashing lights, a celebrity whose silence was somehow revered. But that didn't mean he didn't carry his own battles. Behind the calm facade, there was pain, loneliness, a deep sense of isolation. He had learned, over the years, to deal with the world's constant noise. But sometimes, even he couldn't escape it. As he walked to his car, the cool evening air hit his face, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the studio. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, letting the quiet of the night seep into his bones. The chaos of the day seemed distant now, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel the peace that came with solitude. This was his refuge. This was where he could hear his own thoughts, unfiltered by the expectations of the world. But even as he leaned against the side of his car, he knew the impact of what had just transpired wasn't over. He wasn't someone who sought confrontation, but when the world demanded it, he had to answer in the only way he knew how. And today, he had answered with silence. a silence that had left the host, and perhaps the entire audience, questioning their own assumptions about fame, success, and the need for validation. Back in the studio, the host sat alone, staring at the screen showing the replay of Keanu's exit. His mind was still racing, trying to process the exchange. He had faced tough guests before, celebrities, politicians, even other talk show hosts, but nothing had ever made him feel this small. Keanu's words, simple and unassuming, had torn through his carefully constructed persona. For the first time, the host questioned his own methods, his own purpose in this game of celebrity and fame. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The cameras had stopped rolling, but his mind was still spinning. Keanu's message had been clear. Silence wasn't a weakness, and the pursuit of fame wasn't the end-all of one's existence. But how could someone like him, a man who had spent years chasing attention and recognition, understand that? How could he embrace something as foreign as silence? For a moment, he wondered if Keanu had seen something in him that he couldn't even see in himself. He had always prided himself on his quick wit, his ability to stay ahead of the game, to never let anyone get the better of him. But Keanu had done it without even trying, and that, more than anything, shook him to his core. As the night wore on, the host found himself unable to shake the feeling of discomfort that had settled into his chest. He called his producer, asking for a private moment to himself. The producer agreed, and soon, the host found himself in the dressing room, alone with his thoughts. What was it that Keanu had said? He couldn't shake the words, couldn't stop replaying them in his mind. He thought of all the interviews he'd done, all the guests he'd ridiculed, all the people he'd judged from behind the safety of his desk. Had he been wrong? Had he built an entire career around tearing others down for the sake of entertainment? His eyes fell on his reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at him was the same one he'd seen every day for years. The face of a man who had everything. The fame, the wealth, the recognition. But now, in the quiet aftermath of his confrontation with Keanu, it felt hollow. Was it enough? Was it really all that mattered? He picked up his phone and opened Keanu's social media profile. An image of Keanu smiling, standing in front of a simple backdrop, no extravagant set pieces or flashy lighting. It was a picture of peace, of someone who had found contentment in the smallest of moments. For the first time in years, the host felt envious. Not of Keanu's fame, not of his career, but of the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him, the ability to exist in the world without needing constant validation. It was something the host had never known, something he had longed for, but had never been able to grasp. And then, without thinking, he typed a message to Keanu. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I want to thank you. You've given me something to think about, more than I expected. He hit send, not expecting a reply, but the act itself felt like a small release, like the beginning of a change he wasn't yet ready to fully understand. The days passed, and the interview became the talk of the town. Clips of Keanu's calm response and the host's shaken demeanor went viral. The internet buzzed with opinions. Some praised Keanu's quiet strength, while others criticized the host for his inability to handle the situation. But one thing was certain. The encounter had left an impact. People were talking about it, thinking about it, questioning their own ideas of fame and success. Keanu, as expected, didn't respond publicly. He never did. The silence spoke volumes, as it always had. As for the host, things began to change slowly, almost imperceptibly. He became more reflective, more aware of the words he spoke on air, the way he treated his guests, and the kind of person he wanted to be. The show continued, but something had shifted within him. The fame, the audience's laughter, the biting remarks, it all felt less important now. He began to wonder if there was something more, something deeper that he had been missing all along. One evening, as he stood on stage once more, preparing for another interview, he glanced at the empty chair opposite him. He didn't feel the usual rush of anticipation or the thrill of being the center of attention. Instead, he felt a strange peace, a peace that had been missing for so long. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the spotlight. And in that moment, he realized Keanu had given him something far greater than any audience could ever offer: the gift of silence and the power to listen. The days drifted by, and the world seemed to move on as it always did. The host's late-night talk show continued its usual rhythm, but something had irrevocably shifted within him. He found himself speaking less, listening more, and for the first time in years, truly reflecting on his words and actions. The fast-paced, superficial nature of his job, once a source of immense satisfaction, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. In his private moments, he'd think back to that conversation with Keanu. The interview had been brief, but it had left a lasting imprint on him. For weeks, he couldn't stop wondering how someone like Keanu, famous, adored, and seemingly untouchable, could possess such quiet dignity. There were no outrageous headlines or tabloid scandals with Keanu. No drama, just silence, peace, and an enigmatic calm that made him one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. In contrast, the host had lived for the chaos, the loudness, the drama of celebrity life. His career had been built on teasing, on poking fun, on creating sparks that set fire to the media landscape. Yet, the more he thought about Keanu's unspoken message, the more he realized how exhausting it had all been. The constant need to one-up, the compulsion to remain at the top of the celebrity food chain. It was a game that never truly fulfilled him. One evening, as he sat alone in his dressing room before the show, the host found himself scrolling through Keanu's Instagram again. There were no glamorous photos, no flashy ads, just moments of genuine human connection. Keanu surrounded himself with loved ones, nature, and the kind of quiet moments that seemed so foreign to the host. Yet there was an authenticity there, something the host had always chased but never quite caught. The thought of Keanu's response that day, so simple yet so powerful, kept swirling in his mind. Silence is strength. The need for validation, for applause, only weakens you. It wasn't lost on him that he had been so busy seeking approval, so consumed with the opinions of others, that he had never stopped to ask himself what he truly wanted from this life. The endless interviews, the constant pressure to be on, to entertain, to provoke. What had it all been for? Was it just a fleeting moment of fame? Or was there a deeper sense of purpose that he had neglected all along? The host closed his phone and stared at his reflection in the mirror. A voice whispered in his head, one he hadn't heard before. Maybe it's time to change. Meanwhile, Keanu had long since moved on from the day's confrontation. He'd gone back to his usual routine, filming his next project, spending time with loved ones, quietly contributing to the causes he cared about. But despite his outward calm, the encounter with the host lingered in his mind. Keanu had always been someone who valued authenticity above all else. His career had been built not on the tabloid drama or the flashy moments, but on his choice to remain grounded, true to himself in an industry that often rewarded the exact opposite. He had seen the way the host had reacted to him. The defensive posture, the sarcasm, the thinly veiled insults. It was nothing new. But Keanu also saw something else, a vulnerability beneath that bravado, a desire to be understood, a longing to escape the noise that consumed his life. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He had learned long ago that some things were better left unsaid. He didn't need to force a connection, didn't need to offer advice to someone who wasn't ready to hear it. But he knew, deep down, that the host was struggling with his own internal conflict, caught between the person he appeared to be on screen and the one he feared to be off it. Weeks later, the host found himself standing before his audience once more. But this time something was different. The script felt empty, the jokes forced. He had always prided himself on his ability to make people laugh, to draw attention to himself through clever quips and biting sarcasm. But now it felt like a hollow performance. His usual confidence had been replaced with a quiet unease. The once electrifying rush of the crowd's laughter now seemed more like a hollow echo in his ears. It wasn't until the show ended that he truly understood. As the lights dimmed and the crew began to pack up, the host lingered in his chair, staring at the empty stage. He realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't looking for the applause anymore. He had been chasing approval for so long, and now the weight of it all felt unbearable. He wondered if Keanu, with all his quiet strength, had known this truth long before he did. Maybe Keanu had understood that validation from the outside was nothing compared to the inner peace that came from within. And maybe that was why he had confronted the host with such quiet grace. Because he understood that the only way to find peace was to stop seeking it from the world. It was in that moment that the host felt the shift, the quiet pull toward change. The hunger for external validation no longer consumed him. He had spent so much time trying to please others, trying to maintain his status, trying to remain relevant. But now, in the quiet aftermath, he was beginning to ask himself different questions. What if the real fulfillment came from within? What if the most important voice was his own? The host stood up and walked toward the dressing room door. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the pressure to be anyone but himself. The road ahead wasn't clear, but he knew that it was time to step off the treadmill of fame, to stop playing the game that had defined his life. There was no immediate solution, no easy fix, but the change had already begun. Weeks passed, and the host's show became subtly different. The biting sarcasm, the endless insults, the forced jabs, everything that once defined his persona began to fade. Slowly, but surely, his interactions with guests became more genuine. His interviews became less about making headlines and more about connecting with people on a human level. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, but the host had finally taken the first step toward a more meaningful path. Keanu, on the other hand, continued his life in the quiet way he always had. His world, though far from perfect, was his own. He was still surrounded by the same people, still doing the same things that had always brought him peace. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, in some way, his brief encounter with the host had made a difference. One day, Keanu received a message. It was from the host, and it read simply, "Thank you for showing me a different way." Keanu smiled as he read the message. He didn't need a response. He didn't need any fanfare. The message itself was enough. He understood that the real change had to come from within, and for the host, it seemed like that change had begun. As the days passed, Keanu's silence was still loud to those who knew how to listen. And for the host, the path to true peace had just begun. But neither of them knew that the journey ahead would be filled with more quiet revelations than they could have ever imagined. In the end, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It wasn't about the applause or the spotlight. It was about finding the strength to be silent, to listen to what truly mattered. And in that silence, both men had discovered something profound, the peace that comes not from seeking approval, but from simply being. As we reach the end of this powerful journey, we want to hear from you. What did you take away from Keanu's quiet strength and the host's transformation? How can we all apply this lesson of inner peace and authenticity in our own lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's spark a conversation. If this story left you inspired, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Like the video if you believe true fulfillment starts from within, and subscribe for more stories that challenge and inspire us all. Stay true to yourself and keep finding the strength in silence.